Greetings, friends. My name is Jessa McLean, and I'm here to provide you with some blueprints of disruption. This weekly podcast is dedicated to amplifying the work of activists, examining power structures, and sharing the success stories from the grassroots. Through these discussions, we hope to provide folks with the tools and the inspiration they need to start to dismantle capitalism, decolonize our spaces, and bring about the political revolution that we know we need. Can you still smell smoke? I'm in Ontario, just south of Lake Simcoe, and still today when I walk outside, I can taste campfire in my mouth. And quite literally, Canada is on fire. And this isn't hyperbole, just exploring what's going on online. In order to do this episode, I was horrified by the numbers of forest fires and evacuations that are from coast to coast. Santiago and I wanted to jump in the studio to talk about this. One, deliver the bad news, get a bigger perspective on it, but also to look at the human impact that climate change is having on Canadians right now. So let's start by getting a picture of just how bad it is. But don't worry, we are going to end on a hopeful note. But it's bad. Almost every province, save for very few, are having record-breaking numbers, and we're just in early June. So we first, I think, started paying attention to this wildfire season that we now call it in Alberta, right? We started to see comrades online talking about being evacuated. Just on Discord chat today, we had a comrade on there who was talking about family that had lost a lot, lost structures and regalia. That started in really early May, too, really early on in this fire season. And we're talking about 29,000 people were evacuated from their homes. The Canadian Armed Forces needed to be brought in, and that smoke traveled as far as Scandinavia. BC, is dealing with its usually dry spring, and even though it's not making big news, they had their second biggest wildfire on record, the Donny Creek fire. That we kind of expect, right? In recent history, there have been awful, awful fires, increasingly awful fires out west, right? We're going back to the 2016 Fort McMurray fire, and, just in 2021, the Leighton fire. Devastated these communities. So I think still we thought we were isolated from this problem. But the East Coast is not immune to the forest fires. Newfoundland and Labrador had 34 wildfires before May 1st, right? So they're outpacing their season last season, and which by comparison only saw 2 fires. Nova Scotia has had the largest fire season so far. 200 structures just in the suburbs of Halifax alone burnt to the ground. And, folks who are displaced by this, we're talking about tens of thousands of folks in all of these provinces that are heavily affected. Folks in Nova Scotia got a check for $500. How's that going to even cost all of your expenses for being displaced out of your home for a few days, knowing the cost of hotels and food? People are just not really being supported through these. And, surely now the world's attention has now turned to the Quebec wildfires that are causing incredible amounts of smoke here in Ontario and now New York, right? I think it was the New York Times. The article was Blame Canada, and it's a really sepia tone photograph of the New York City skyline is just as hazy as it's ever been. The Quebec wildfires are no joke. 14,000 people were evacuated in June. They're already having their worst season on record. Again, And like Ontario, I'll mention later on in a couple minutes, they've stripped a lot of the resources that they had to fight these fires, and almost all of it to prevent them, right? All of the funding that goes into prevent the fires is gravy. And Quebec even admitted, they have 153 fires burning that they cannot bring under control, right? They only have the resources to even consider 20 to 30 fires. in fighting 20 to 30 fires. Like, that is astonishing. The rest of the fires are just left out of control until, like international aid comes in, which is apparently what we're relying on in a lot of these provinces. But like, Santiago, is this the first time for me? So yeah, Santiago is here, by the way. But for me, I've talked about it on the show before that I have never really felt climate anxiety. I understand the urgency. I buy into the science. I understand it's a priority, all of that, but I experience a lot of anxiety, for the record, so I know exactly what it feels like, but I never had that climate anxiety that a lot of friends have described to us, right? I think that is not solely for a younger generation, but either way, it didn't impact me until now. And it's one of those, not until it really affects you do you fully grasp, the urgency or the importance of something. But, choking on smoke for 4 days, I think will do that to you. Are you hopeful other people are getting a little bit of a wake-up call?
I mean, I really, really hope so. Right now, we know like the Golden Horseshoe, which has been affected by this, is the largest concentration of people in Canada, and for the most part, never have had to deal with any particularly large climate emergencies. It's relatively tame here, and suddenly seeing the city covered in smoke, spending a few minutes outside and you start coughing, having a hard time breathing, short of breath, that's not something anyone here has ever experienced before in this context. And then also New York City, right? I mean, we're talking about 2 out of 4 of the largest cities in North America, right? For anyone who thought like they were immune from this, that this was just an issue for California, for BC. No, nobody is immune to the effects of climate change. So I hope that they're starting to realize. I mean, for me, it's not the first time experiencing climate anxiety. It's been like what I'm experiencing. I think I would actually call more climate frustration, because for me, like, I remember when I was in grade 1, I think I talk about something like I've tried to pinpoint like my radicalization. I think my radicalization began with learning about the effects of climate change. And I remember that was something I used to care so much about that in elementary school. And I used to think, oh, well, there's so much time, we'll take care of this. There's no way that we don't solve this problem, and I used to say, like, I'm going to grow up and solve climate change, as any kid would arrogantly think that they could single-handedly do. But the climate frustration is the fact that, like, just, seeing the exactly what you said was going to happen begin to happen where you live it's like, you don't want to say like, I told you so. You just want to like yell and like scream and like, it's infuriating that, like, of course this was going to happen, right? Like,
but I think people still felt like it was further off than this. It's often spoken about like the next generation, what will they have to look forward to? But I mean, that generation is now here. They're staying inside for recess because there's too much smoke outside, because the air quality levels are the worst they've ever been in history. And yeah, when you talk about how like the size of the population that in the past few days has intimately experienced the smoke. Now, will they all attribute it to climate change? No, we know that not even our premier here in Ontario wants to attribute it to climate change, right? He's just blaming campers and asking them to please avoid, lighting fires while they go camping. But I think a lot of people will make that connection, right? Like, But I don't know, of course, online isn't the best gauge, right? When you go on and post about this, the response is it's arson, it's human activity, it's just that the vegetation is dry. And, you're like, not even now, you're still not making the connection. Like, you're not bothering to actually read into it. And
it's particularly frustrating in this part of the world. Like, I could understand somebody who lived in an area of the world with less seasons, maybe being a bit more hesitant. Not even. I still don't understand it. But, like, I remember seeing slowly over the course of time how, it snows later and later in the year. We get less and less snow. Like, I used to remember seeing snow sometimes in October. Definitely, I was building snow forts in November, right? Like, I remember that. And now, sometimes it's mid-December. You still haven't really gotten a proper snowfall.
And where were our April showers? Like, there has been almost no rain this spring. Like, I don't have the numbers, but I have a garden. And I know I have to water it way too often. The people in Alberta were calling for rain. Quebec has had very little rain. Same with BC. It's been like a record dry season. And folks need to understand, like, that's the trend. That's every year we keep breaking precipitation records in the wrong direction. And then, wondering why our wildfires are out of control. And, the way we manage the land is just atrocious as well. Like, it doesn't take into account that these things can happen.
And it's not just us either. Like, I know we're talking about Canadian wildfires, but, like, I know that there's been wildfires all over Europe in the last few years. I remember I was in Portugal in 2018, and they were talking about the wildfires back then. And Australia's been dealing with their wildfires in the past year. This is the entire world is catching fire. Like, the world is literally on fire. That was like a metaphor and a joke, haha, before. But, like, the world has literally been on fire for a few years now.
It's literally how we picture the apocalypse, the orange smoke and fires burning everywhere. And it's scary.
And, like, I mean, I was joking about how, when Bay Street and Wall Street have to choke the same air as the rest of us, hopefully something good will come from that. And when they're not in their Teslas with, what do they call it? Bio weapon grade air filter, whatever the fuck.
I know, I teased you. I was like, I don't know. Rich people can afford a lot of air purifiers and trips to places that don't have a smoke cloud.
And they can also afford tickets to baseball games where they have to choke down the same smoke. Like, a lot of people, I was seeing a lot of pictures in New York from the baseball stadium showing, like, the air quality, like they could see all the smoke. I mean, they still like to go outside. They want to have their patio brunches and yada yada, right? Like, you can't escape it. None of us can escape it. The only way you can escape it. No, that is
the reality.
Only way to escape it is if you live in, like, that futuristic city that Saudi Arabia wants to build, like the one that's like a big line that's like few stories high and it's enclosed. Like, maybe like if you're in Dubai, you can escape it. But no, like, here, you want to go, you want to spend time outside, you got to choke on the same air as the rest of us. And really, like, at what point do they start realizing, hey, this is not worth it? It's not worth it.
Like, I was so angered by the idea or the prospect that this might be a normal occurrence for us. That we will have another 3 days, 4 days of smoke, or every spring, we're going to have to plan for this smoky season in the way that other communities have to plan for fire season. And I know it's so naive for me to think like I wouldn't have ever been impacted, but it wasn't really until it hit full force. And I'm really pissed off too. It really kind of sparked an anger. Not the anxiety is there, but it also came with a lot of anger because you're seeing these patterns that you mentioned, like around the world and in BC and California. And it's obvious to everybody watching, but the people that are supposed to be leading us are sitting around, shrugging their shoulders, doing nothing, or worse. Ontario cut 67% of the emergency forest firefighting budget. 67%, like that's gutted. The whole Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry budget was just absolutely gutted by the Conservatives, who then turn around and the only thing they have to say is like, hey, campers, even the air quality. The only people that were providing any information on what to do with this air quality was really like the news and a few of your local health authorities. What do we call them? We don't call them that. Anyway, yeah, the public health authorities, like the same local authorities that Ford poo-poos when it comes to reactions. We're the only people providing any information. That we should wear a mask or people with asthma shouldn't go. There was really no guidance on how to react. Like, I fear for any mass evacuations happening in Ontario when they can't even figure out what to tell us when the air is just filled with smoke. Like, I really would have no idea what to do or where to go in that condition. And I have no faith that our authorities even give a shit watching them see BC and see all of this and be like, yeah, even their own budget. They're like, no, we're going to cut that in half. Like, as though forest fires are just going to half themselves, even though you're doing nothing about climate justice or land management. It's ridiculous. Even JP Hornick, like our favorite Labour leader in Ontario, well, mine, they reported to the CBC that last year in Ontario, when we're talking about forest fires, we were short 23 crews, and this year we're short 50 crews. So, there really are very few communities in Ontario that wouldn't be in a situation with a wildfire, like.
I know that it doesn't need saying, but just the level of financial irresponsibility from Conservatives around this is truly stunning. I mean, it takes a certain audacity here, because the cost that and the damages in everything that is going to be needed to be addressed by not planning for this, by not preparing for this, by continuing to invest in fossil fuels, it's going to cost so much. One thing I think about a lot is just because it's a personal anecdote is my stepmom. She has a relative who lives in California who a few years ago, their entire neighborhood burnt down, right? And they only recently got the replacement built. But just thinking about first of all, the trauma that your entire neighborhood is everything all the places you go, everywhere you spend time, wiped off the map. And then also, there's the personal trauma of that, but then there's also just how much does it cost to build an entirely new neighborhood to replace that? The continued cost of this every time that there's and it's not just fires, right? Hurricanes are getting stronger, right? So when a hurricane wipes a city off, the cost of addressing that, it's so much more than what it costs to actually address climate change, than what it costs to convert to renewable technologies, to do what we already have the ability to do, the financially responsible decision. I mean, at this point, I don't even know if social murder goes far enough, because the scale of the cost of human life that we are going to see from this goes beyond just simply defining it as social murder. I think it's more severe. This is an active complacency in the destruction of lives that it's horrible.
I don't think there is a word to describe it. I'm thinking of other terms that we use to describe large losses of life or deliberate actions, and really none of them fully encapsulate what our leaders are doing with the lack of climate action. And on top of that, then the lack of mitigation. If you're not going to do anything about climate, what are you going to do about the forest fires or the resultant actions that are going to come from it? And we're finding out like absolutely nothing or less than nothing. Like they're going to start stripping whatever supports that were there and, doing nothing with them. It's a complete failure, but also, again, always that onus is on us too, because we have been very complacent in allowing folks like Ford to completely decimate the province, including, mind you, the 2019 budget was awful, and that was the smallest red flag that was seen, in terms of the forest fire budget. So how do you fight on all of those fronts? But, it's a daunting task, frankly. But there are, everyone goes on it. Forest fires are natural, right? I just wanted to add to like that economic cost that you mentioned. I wanted to bring up. There's a real environmental impact as well of this many forest fires, right? Like the emissions that go into the environment from. And remember, every province almost is having a record-breaking year. That means the country is also, if you look at the numbers there, they've almost doubled last year's in terms of the area that's been destroyed. And they're on pace to match and surpass 2021, which was just absolutely devastating. And we've seen no increased reaction on any front. And it is possible to set up systems that allow for preparedness and responsiveness to these disasters, right? On top of that, Indigenous knowledge has been suggested, obviously, for a long time, to be incorporated in preventing forest fires, right? Whereas the Western approach seems to be to just try to put them out, all these different ways to put them out. And we do use controlled burning to a degree, but, it doesn't come with that stewardship, right? That responsibility to the land, that constant maintenance that it requires in order, to live in balance. We don't apply that whatsoever to how we address this. You wanted to talk about kind of local, being able to respond kind of locally and incorporating that. Before you do, I'm just going to, I looked up the Cuban example that's often been touted for hurricane responsiveness. Like they have notoriously low mortality rates when it comes to natural disasters like hurricanes. And that's because, they spend part of their very limited budget in Cuba on preparing people, on putting services in place, of turning primary schools into shelters that can incorporate people and their animals, and providing locations for folks to store their valuables where they won't be damaged, even if the structure that they live in is destroyed. And, they get 7 days warning, like really, really intensive warning and drills. So everyone tends to know exactly what to do in an emergency. Even with, you can imagine how stringent the budget is in Cuba and their need to prioritize different things. But surely preventing the loss of life is one that should be prioritized over, another $13 billion for the LNG pipeline or for the Trans Mountain pipeline, really skewed priorities. But, we saw a lot of people weren't getting the supports that they needed. Right? They didn't have anywhere to evacuate to. They couldn't access the funds that were supposed to be accessible to them. Much of what's only offered in Canada is really monetary. You might get a check from Red Cross that's been matched by the federal government, and maybe a shelter is set up in the town next to you, but that's really it in terms of supports. I feel like we can do better there.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's so much more that needs to be done in terms of supporting people. And I think the reality that we kind of have to start wrapping our heads around is the fact that, fighting climate change is absolutely a priority, but we need to start planning around how we are going to help people through the very real consequences of climate change that we are going to be seeing more and more. Right, it's too late to prevent that, and we are going to see more and more catastrophes, and now we have to do what we can to help people through that. And the reality is that there's government response is not enough. It will never be enough. They can try, but it will not be enough. And we need to take this as an opportunity to organize our communities to be able to respond and to support each other through this. Because at the end of the day, that's more effective than any government response as well. Anything that would come from the government has to be working with the community. And we need to start thinking about that, because how many people have seriously thought and put a plan in place for any catastrophe? Like, that's something I remember when I was a kid that used to get talked about a bit more, having like enough fresh water and, stuff like that. But the reality is that for most of us, like, I haven't heard anything about that since my childhood. I certainly don't think about it. Most people don't think about it. It's not something a lot of us are ready for. And we need to prepare not just ourselves, but prepare to help others. And because, like, we saw what happened in Alberta, right? Like, people were left very confused, very stranded. I know a lot of people who couldn't get access to the funds that they were providing for relief. There was all kinds of issues there. And it's not okay. It's not enough to just, like, see this and say, this is wrong, do better. Like, I think we really have to kind of do it ourselves a little bit, because that's just, this government who caused this, the same people who caused this don't give a fuck about helping the people who are now suffering the consequence. They're not going to care about that.
See, here's where I start to get, like, you saw my face kind of screw up a little bit, because, like, it's that catch-22. And yes, of course, we always need mutual aid, but, like, setting up systems to respond to this, like, that is what our government is for. We know it is possible for governments to fund it and structure it and still really closely incorporate the local, right? I read a couple examples of folks genuinely incorporating that Indigenous knowledge that we were talking about earlier. That doesn't just help in preventing forest fires, but also, learning how fire behaves on the landscape, planning access and escape routes. Real kind of the needs of every particular community will be different. So the need to incorporate that on that local level, or fund local agencies like health agencies, but then empower them. I think the model that we use is we hardly fund them, and then we strip them of most of their autonomy. And they have, for an example, in Ontario, these local health agencies having to use their resources to explain, what to do when there's smoke in your air, rather than actually responding to folks that might need help. Because that's the job of the government. And if we take that over the same way food banks have existed, rather than demanding, like, kind of a structural change, I get kind of frustrated. But in the meantime, people are without a home, without resources. And yeah, because I remember when the floods out east happened, I took real issue with the federal government promoting the donation match program that they have with the Red Cross. And I know it's something that's normally done, but again, it was like that reliance on philanthropy, on donations, when our tax dollars totally could cover this with better choices, that we've talked about a million times on the show, and they don't. Like, it's like...
No, and to be clear, I don't mean that model of, like, donations and stuff like that. But what I do mean is that, like, it's gonna get bad, right? Like, what happens when a community is destroyed? When it's wiped off the map, like, there's more than just financial needs. Like, when you talk about health, and you talk about, there's physical health, but there's also, like, your social and mental well-being, and these are things that we need to come together as a community to support. That's things that donations can't give you, and it is. I have, like, looking at this and looking at this response, really have the feeling that we're not ready for that. And you see it in Alberta, a province that like obviously doesn't care, and like the very mediocre efforts that they made, right? And I guess that's just the reality that it's gonna take some coming together in a new kind of way, because help isn't coming. And I guess that's me being very pessimistic right now, but that is the reality, that it's gonna get really bad, and it's gonna continue to get bad. And there's ways that we can take that and make it a little bit less bad, and then also through that hopefully lead to other actions as well. It's not enough to just, organize to support each other, but then maybe organize to... I keep thinking, and this might be not the best thing to say, but I keep thinking of like this line from the Hunger Games, actually. The fire is catching, and if we burn, you burn with us.
You're talking to the rich.
I'm saying that, like,
to the capital.
At what point do you shut things down, right? At what point is it like, oh, our community is being wiped off the map? No, you don't get to pretend like that's not happening. You don't get to pretend like life goes on, When you talk about why a society, like, why do we tolerate a government's existence, is that social contract, right? And what is happening right now is a violation in every form of that social contract. And I know how I sound. But the reality is that...
I'm nodding my head. You sound like you're preaching to the choir here. I'm with you. I still see a lot of deflection. I'm with you, though. I do hold promise, just also because of my personal experience, right? Like, it upped it a notch in my mind, in terms of prioritization or urgency or whatever it is, militancy, maybe even. But I'm still also seeing a lot of deflection, a lot of blame Canada, not climate change, or where we're calling it the Quebec wildfires. It's still removing us a step, and the smoke is clearing. So, I'm afraid it's got to get worse before you'll actually see, the voting populace of New York or Toronto or Ottawa really make those connections, because
this will be old news in a week. They're gonna forget about this in a week. Like,
right?
I know
Trump's
that.
already been indicted for something else, right? We've moved on.
Yeah, no, I know that this is gonna be old news really quick, but it's also the reality is that this is going to keep happening. And this fire, all things considered, the smoke's bad, but it is pretty mild, versus a lot of other things that are going to be happening. So, yeah, it's more of just like, I guess, another attempt at warning people. And I don't even know, like, obviously with this audience preaching to the choir a little bit, but I just had like a certain amount of frustration that I need to get out. Like, because just what the hell, right? like how did we get here? I know how we got here, but yeah, no, I don't know.
It's okay. And it's like, we don't always have a solution on how to get out of it, but, looking to that local model and other places that, do respond adequately. But again, that's reactionary. A necessity, right? We now do have to react to climate change. It is affecting us. It's not an arbitrary thing, at least to the people of southeastern Ontario, or, anyone even closer in proximity to those fires. But yeah, I guess it's just what people will do with that anxiety or that new sense of urgency, because there's no doubt I am not alone in my experience here in Ontario, and that the people of New York are not as naive to just simply blame Canada or blame Trudeau or blame arsonists on this. This is a pattern, and this is just the beginning of the summer. So,
yeah, I think about in this situation, I think about like young people who are growing up in this world where, they've been warning about this, because this has been kind of like the theme, of their generation, is like, that climate anxiety, that climate change is going to, because they're actually going to live through it too. Like they're going to live through what happens 20 years from now, 30, 40 years from now, when, like, I mean, if this is happening now, you can only imagine how much worse it's going to get. And so, but it's also like, at the same time, everything is bad, right? Housing is bad. No one can afford housing, food insecurity, all these things. And it's like, how much can you push people? How much can you push people before, like, there's not enough left to maintain that social contract? And that's what I'm thinking about right now. It's just like,
I think a lot of people, and like this is partly what our show is about, even though we didn't really hit on it today, is they've lost the means to challenge that social contract, to ensure that their end of the deal is upheld. There are ways to punish the populace should we not uphold our end, right? But the mechanisms available to us that we're willing to take are less and less and less and more risky and require more of a time and energy commitment than ever. And so, yeah, you better hope that this smoke has stirred this little extra bit of energy, at least in folks who weren't engaged in climate activism already. I would like to see an uptick in some of those memberships, in some of the organizations that are actively trying, like our last guest, like TTC riders and all the different avenues folks have to fight climate change. But there's no denying that the human impact is already here, and we've got to search for solutions on how to support folks, because we didn't mention it, but as with almost all other issues, it will hit marginalized people more economically. Like they talk about it on a global scale, how like the global south will experience it disproportionately, and they are already disproportionately more have less economic power, than the northern hemisphere, and how that allows us to kind of absolve ourselves of really acting right now, because it's not going to affect us right away. But that's getting harder and harder to sell at this point. And yeah, like it's folks that don't have air filters at home who need to keep the window open because it's hot as hell in their apartment on the 22nd floor.
and it's workers who have to work outside in these conditions regardless. You think about like agriculture, like all the migrant agriculture workers who are, they don't have the opportunity to stay safe from this. And, going outside for like 30 minutes felt like shit. I can't imagine what having to work, do hard labor outside all day, how that must feel. That must feel awful.
And I heard so few birds this morning. That's usually what wakes me up. It's about 5:30 that the birds really start annoying the shit out of me on most mornings. But this morning it was like one fella out there, and I was waiting for the other ones to chime in, and I'm not feeling all that great about that. That caused a whole level of anxiety that I couldn't imagine. Like we talk about workers not being able to get in, like animals cannot escape this, not in any meaningful way. And the environmental impact of all of these fires is even yet to be told, right? These are record levels. So I hope folks get a new sense of urgency around this and, put the pressures where they need to be.
And the reality is we need to step up in Ontario, because in terms of climate activism, we talk about how there's a lot of it going on here. When people look for where to get involved, there's not a lot of places to turn. There really needs to be a lot more happening here. And hopefully, you see BC, how much more climate activism there is in BC, right?
I feel like they're looking at us going, you guys are like 10 years behind on this climate anxiety, like living through the heat dome and watching the fires that have been raging there for the past, I think, gave them a spur that we've not had. Not to mention, they have higher industries that are contributing to climate change over there. But, we certainly have to get our asses in gear. I think I'll give a shout out to the guardians of the Greenbelt here who are doing everything they can to, help protect the forests that we do have from development. But
I think also if people really want to like have someone to blame specifically, like me being here in Toronto, like I want to see people go down to Bay Street and just make some noise, point some fingers. Same thing with Wall Street, in New York. All the New Yorkers who are dealing with that, like your problem is right there. I could walk to Bay Street right now. Like I think we're not holding, like we need to start like actively making the lives of the people responsible uncomfortable. There shouldn't be time that goes by where they're allowed to go on and keep making those investments and keep destroying the planet and acting like everything's fine. Like there needs to be we need like a shut down Bay Street movement right now, like and I know like Occupy Wall Street was in the end not too much changed, so we need to learn from also like the mistakes of that. But I was just thinking about how France is in month, I don't even know what number, month 3, 4, however long they've been protesting, right? That's the energy we need right now, right? Like, I really hope people will at some point realize that there's no asking nicely, there's no hoping that things will change. We keep hoping that, oh, well, when things get bad enough, they'll see how bad it is and then they'll do something and they'll make some machines to absorb all the carbon and everything will be fine. Like, no, that's not going to happen. And I know like that's just, I keep ranting about this all episode and it's just my anger really coming through at this because I am so fed up with this, and that's really just where I'm at right now is I'm just completely fed up. But I really like we need to get out there. We need to start shutting things down because how much longer do we want to wait? Like, do we want to wait until the fires aren't in rural Quebec and suddenly it's not 14,000 people, but hundreds of thousands of people being displaced? Is that enough? Like, is there like a number of human people displaced that's enough? Is there like a number of communities burning down that's enough? Like, do we need to go through a month in smoke? Do we have to block out the sun? Do we have to bring a whole new ice age? Like, what does it take? Like what point do we say, like, no, actually, you don't get to keep doing business as usual. You have violated our agreement, and we're going to stop you. You don't get to keep doing this. Like, at some point, that needs to happen. And I don't want to wait for a single more person to be affected by this before we do that. And there's a certain, I also acknowledge there's a certain amount of like privilege in the sense that like what, like, yeah, like not so much privilege isn't the right word, but like the fact that, yeah, it's real for me right now because, you see the smoke, you smell the smoke. And I know that like people all over the world have been living this reality for a while now. But, sometimes things have to happen to you for you to fully grasp it. And I mean, we've been angry about this here for forever anyways. Like I've been yelling about this forever, but now it's really like, oh, come on. Oh, come on now. Anyways, that's my spiel.
I think the models that you're suggesting, that we didn't quite hash out here, but the local models of mutual aid and connectiveness that we talk about a lot, like to almost address every issue we've ever talked about on the show, right? That Black Panther model, there's all kinds of examples you can go to. If those were in a robust state, right, and that working class consciousness was heightened, through these activities, then I think we'd be in a better position to hold the people accountable, to shut down Bay Street with tact, and purpose and be successful. So not only do those networks hold the key to making sure as few people as possible suffer from wildfires, which would exist without climate change. It's still something, you'd have to prepare for and react to. But creating networks in a different way, in the way that we suggest that, that work in other places, I think would open more doors in terms of solving more problems too. So we will keep trying to talk about that and give folks a little more guidance on that. That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Thank you for joining us. Also, a very big thank you to the producer of our show, Santiago Helou Quintero. Blueprints of Disruption is an independent production operated cooperatively. You can follow us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content, and if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. Not only does our support come from the progressive community, so does our content. So reach out to us and let us know what or who we should be amplifying. So until next time, keep disrupting.